Our last panel of the day, and thank you all very much for staying the course, is going to concentrate on energy development in Alaska. I'm not going to take a long time to introduce the speakers because you have their biographies, but we're very thankful to have Lieutenant Governor Meade Treadwell on our panel, and he is joined by Steve Phillips, who's the manager for exploration and appraisal for Shell in Alaska. Julie Kitka, who unfortunately is unable to be here today because she is ill, has asked her friend Amy Spark Dobmeyer with the North Star Group, who works on Native issues, to fill in for her place. We're very thankful, Amy, that you're able to do that. And finally, Jim Ayers, who is the president of Alaska Strategies and has been working on Alaskan resource issues for a very long time. Let me begin with an open question to the entire panel, and we'll see where we go from there. With Shell planning to drill off the north coast of Alaska this year, as we've been talking about, the prospects of offshore U.S. Arctic oil and gas development are rapidly becoming a potential reality. I'd like to ask the panelists, what do you see as the main benefits for the United States of offshore Alaskan oil and gas development? And what, in your view, are the principal challenges that still need to be overcome? Governor, would you like to start?
Well, thank you. Can people hear me? I guess I want to say the principal benefits of Arctic oil development are the things that it can do for our country and the things that it will do for the world. As far as our country is concerned, we are still very dependent on foreign oil. We're still very dependent on bringing energy in from other nations, some of which are not very friendly to us. And the potential in the Arctic that we're going to look at, and my colleague to my right will speak about the potential more specifically, but you're talking about huge amounts of oil in the Arctic and huge amounts of oil in the Alaska province. We've gone through a process now that's over 6 years since those leases were issued. And billions of dollars has been spent. Upgrades have happened because of the Macondo incident, and I believe that we are prepared. Now, at the same time, while I believe that is the case, we also recognize there are risks. I sat in a cabinet at one point where we all held hands and said, yes, there is something that always could fall between the lip and the cup, and you want to make sure that you're prepared. And I think we have insisted that Shell be prepared. I was on the rigs that are going and looking at the IVEC, the oil spill response vessel, which will be part of the oil spill response vessel if that contingency comes along. But I will tell you, the state of Alaska has always argued to keep pushing the envelope on oil spill research, oil and ice research. We should keep pushing the envelope on improving Arctic technologies, and I believe that we're at the start of something big. Something very big. The Alaska pipeline is running 1/3 full. When I was in high school and college, it was being built and began operation. It once shipped 2.2 million barrels a day. It's now shipping less than 600,000. That less than 600,000, even then, is 10% of America's oil supply. And the potential for the country is large. The last thing I would say is just in the context of what's happening in the north, and we had a map up before of the circumpolar area. 6 of the 8 Arctic countries are drilling for oil or in the process of drilling for oil offshore. And those 6 countries have all come to the conclusion, one way or another, that the environmental risks can be managed and that the benefits are worthwhile for their people. And I believe this is a place where the United States should be leading. I believe that we lead with the best technology. I believe that we lead with a significant regulatory structure that involves the people who live on the ground as well as the state and the national government. And I think that we are at the beginning of a major province for the world where the USGS says perhaps a quarter of the world's energy, conventional energy, is to be found. And this is something that will be significant for many years to come.
Thank you very much. Steve?
Yeah, so just to build on Meade's comments, it sounds like we think alike, basically. And obviously when Shell's invested the amount that it has in its exploration program to date over the last 6 years. We get the same sort of questions from our own shareholders, really. So, what is the benefit of this? Why are we doing it? I think for the US, it's threefold. I mean, it is a contribution to domestic energy security. It is oil. We firmly believe it's oil, as I think most of industry and academia does. So there is an immediacy and perhaps not some of the tariff and subsidy challenges that getting gas out of Alaska has seen in the last 30 or 40 years. I think it comes down to jobs, and that's when scale is actually very important. So that the scale of some of these opportunities offshore Alaska, I often refer to it, it's like exploring 40, 50 years ago. I mean, the area has been off limits, essentially due to geography, harsh conditions, technology hasn't been there, low oil price in the mid to late 90s in particular. But the scale of success we envisage, could double the TAPS throughput. So that has benefits for the state of Alaska. It would have benefits for domestic security. Projects of that scale, have the ability to create anywhere between 55 and 90,000 jobs. Now, that's a lot of jobs. I mean, it's nice to actually be part of a company that says they could stimulate that much project, that a project could stimulate that much job growth domestically in the state and in the US. And then let's not forget the economics. So I think the real point of the question is projects of that scale could generate $200 billion in federal revenue. They could generate $145 billion in payroll. So very, very significant scale.
Amy, do you want to?
Hello, I'm Amy Spark-Dobmeyer. I am Chupik Alaska native of the Kusinamit tribe of the Bering Sea. That's Chivak. It's about 50 miles inland from Hooper Bay and Scammon Bay. I'm very glad and eager to have the blessing of Julie Kitka of the Alaska Federation of Natives to come in and address you. I couldn't speak for AFN or Julie, but I can probably speak to a couple of our comments about the benefits of development. And first and foremost, Alaska Natives would want the developing company to know that what is tantamount important for Natives is food security, and in Alaska that's called subsistence. That is what literally feeds you and your family through the year, and that is literally what makes your culture. So that is what has sustained us for over 10,000 years, and that can't be interfered with. It has to maintain. And Julie had also referred to historically the Marshall Plan, I think in terms of opening the Arctic. A reference to the Marshall Plan points to nation building. I think at best, rural and coastal Alaska can hope to maybe finally come up to par in terms of infrastructure to get actual nation building in our own state. So those would probably be the most foremost benefits of development in oil and gas.
Thank you. Jim?
Thanks, Charlie, and thanks for inviting me here. Certainly a privilege to be with this panelist. I haven't seen Meade in a while, but you mentioned that I'd been in resources in Alaska, and Drew and I both smiled about that. I actually have been in Alaska since the mid-'70s, and when I first came to Alaska, I was working as a consultant. As I am today, it seems to be a horse I can ride, or at least it gets me to where I need to go sometime, most of the time. And one of the first projects I worked on in Alaska, I was working in a project to expand economic development in rural Alaska, working with none other than Alaska Federation of Natives and Julie Kitka and some others. And we put a windmill in Chivak on the Head Start Center to see if we could generate enough electricity that the Head Start Center wouldn't have to use diesel fuel. And a guy named John Pengayak, Teresa Pengayak was the Head Start teacher there. And it was interesting because if you follow it was an idea that came out of the community, of some elders in the community that talked about the wind. They'd seen wind generators and windmills in the Midwest, and they were very interested in the idea that wind might be able to get them off of diesel at the local Head Start Center. So I'm going to go to 30,000 feet, and then I'll be right back. But my view of the opportunities and challenges of energy development in Alaska has more to do with who we are as a people. The common heritage of humankind is the question of energy development in the Arctic. It's about who we are now as a people. I remember at Purdue University, a professor, Selchuk, used to hold his arms out and he says, you know what this is? I'd say no. And he'd say, that's how long there's been life around the planet, but that's how long we've been around. And about the tip of that fingernail is how long we've realized that how much we can do to the planet. And I also would say that, and in fairness, my clients include the Pew Charitable Trust and Ocean Conservancy and other non-government organizations, although I recently finished a project with the Coast Guard and was on the panel to review the Deepwater Horizon response in the Gulf of Mexico. So let me say that the Arctic is the question of our age. The opportunities are about who we are as a people. The challenge is demonstrating that we have the intellectual capability to bring the energy necessary to the people not only of this country, but throughout the world, and do no harm. A basic principle of ensuring that we can develop energy resources today while maintaining the health and biodiversity of the Arctic, that I won't go into, but I'd love to, and the subsistence way of life. Now that's really what the goal is all about. The various objectives that we've heard talked about are specific things that are siloed. Somebody mentioned the silo of the silo of silence, or the silo of how are we going to do the logistics. But each of those need to be integrated. We need to find a way to bring the intellectual capacity of we as a people, the indigenous people, the local and traditional knowledge, our Western science, the best of industry's engineering and capability, and bring them together first with a discussion with people at the local level and then the national level about how can we do this right? Is there a way to do this? It ought not to be the antiquated way of litigation and adversity. The real opportunity is for us as a people to demonstrate that we can do this, but we can do this right. And that includes those things I was just mentioning. By the way, there's a USGS Circular 1370 that came out 1 year ago this week from the good Department of Interior that identified the science needs of the Arctic. That's not a big question. We ought not to say, geez, what does that mean? It's outlined in there. We need to do, and I'll just do a dive now into that. I'll come off at 30,000 feet and go straight into that specific if you want, or I can wait.
Well, why don't you wait?
Oh,
Is that
terrific.
okay? Let me play the devil's advocate a minute. A month or two ago, Citibank came out with a very controversial study suggesting that the development of unconventional oil in this country, the combination that over the next decade, that when the president's new fuel economy standards go into a full effect, that will knock off 2 million barrels a day of imports, 3 million barrels a day from unconventional oil production in the United States, and the prospect of a big hunk of additional oil coming from the oil sands in Canada, as well as the mandate for ethanol of 36 billion gallons, would suggest that basically, according to Ed Morse, the author of the study, that as early as 2020 to 2025, the U.S. could effectively be importing very little oil. Now let's assume that Shell finds a huge oil deposit offshore, which we hope you do.
Thank you.
Is there any danger, and Meade will remember the battles on trying to get lifting the ban on Alaskan oil for our allies in Japan. Is there any danger if all of a sudden a large deposit were found, but that the market for that oil was not in the continental United States, but in the international market, that would become another cause célèbre among conservatives and others who said we shouldn't export our domestic oil?
You asking me?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. Let me put it this way. I hope his study is right. I believe America is a natural resource-rich country and that we ought to be developing our natural resources. It's one of the things that the world tends to demand that we make. We're doing extraordinary efforts now to get rare earth elements out of the ground in Alaska to break a Chinese monopoly, for example. And there's things that we should be doing in America more to break other monopolies or other consortia that tend to price against us. But in this particular case, it may be that he's right, or it may be just like Bill Clinton's balanced budget, where it disappeared very quickly. But all told, I think where we need to be to understand the Arctic is that when it comes to getting $1 to drill a hole or to lay a piece of pipe, we are in a very competitive global market. The companies that are coming to Alaska are the same companies that are going to Russia, the same companies that are going to Canada, same companies that are going to Greenland or Australia or many other oil provinces around the world. So we have to make sure that our system is set up to receive and incented to receive capital. The next thing is that if we set up inefficiencies, if we say you can drill for this but you can't ship it, then what we're really saying is, okay, you may still be able to ship it. Alaska Oil, for all but 7% of its production, I believe, was forced to be sold in the United States. That meant the construction of a pipeline across Panama. It meant that we took most of the margin from that oil, and rather than directing it back into energy investment, it went into other activities such as shipping that wasn't necessary. You had a situation at one point where oil was going west from the Gulf of Mexico to Asian markets and east from Alaska to North American markets in the same, across the same isthmus. And I think when you take a look at the challenge that we've had on natural gas, which is not unlike what the ambassador was telling us just a while ago on McKinsey gas, is that whenever we tell ourselves we can't go for world markets, we find that we're probably going for the wrong market. So I think it's very important for us to understand that we're attracting capital from world markets and we're affecting world markets. And frankly, production in world markets helps us all with reducing the price of energy. Now, some people will say, well, don't drill in Alaska because, if you're going to ship it abroad. Well, right now, I believe that, with what California is taking, it's going to be used in the United States. But I will say it would be probably imprudent for us as a country to put up barriers again.
Excellent answer. Steve, we've heard a lot today about the dangers of land transportation in Alaska with climate change and the melting of the tundra and so forth. Does this pose a logistical challenge if you find oil offshore and have to try to tie it into the Alaska pipeline with a spur pipeline? Is there ways to deal with that in your mind?
So yes. Oh, yes. I mean, there will definitely be challenges. We have leasehold in the Beaufort Sea, which is, let's say, a bit more proximal to the existing onshore infrastructure in the North Slope. So I would say the challenges there are less insurmountable. Just tyranny of distance isn't so much of a factor. In the Chukchi Sea, where we're offshore by about 80 miles, then you can envisage that, an offshore fixed installation, an offshore pipeline, and then depending on the route back through the North Slope of Alaska and NPRA, 300, 400-mile onshore pipeline, it's going to have significant challenges. We've heard today about this sort of euphemism we keep calling science, and sometimes you need to dig a little bit deeper to understand what science means, because it means different things to different people. So we are because we are the current, let's say, baton holder in the relay of Arctic offshore development, we're actually spending and driving a lot of the science that is currently being undertaken. And by that I mean it's both understanding the ice, which is fundamental for the offshore, has been pointed out. So we do geotechnical surveys year on year. It talks about ecology, biology, oceanography type science. So out of necessity, because the project needs that, and I'm trying to sort of get to the answer is, science will actually dictate what the environment is, what the baseline is, both now and as we progress through the next 10 years towards a development. But I think we are, prepared to co-contribute to the science discussion. We've made data available. We've gone into agreements with the North Slope Borough. So we're trying to recognize. Someone mentioned the word imperialism earlier on, I think, on the previous panel. We're very conscious of that. I mean, our more than 500 engagements with the local communities and villages in Alaska, it's not about what we want, it's about what native communities want and what they see the challenges are.
Thank you. Amy, maybe you or Jim would like to address the next question, although you're welcome if you'd like. Even absent a major oil spill, there are obviously several ways that oil and gas development offshore Alaska could have the potential to affect the lives and livelihoods of native communities. We have already discussed the potential effects on the sea life that provides vital food supplies for native communities. There are also obviously issues of noise and air pollution. But the effects of offshore oil and gas development will presumably not affect all native groups the same way, simply because of where the oil and or gas might be found. Can you give us an idea of how different native group stakeholders will be affected to different extents, and if there are any sizable differences within the native community as to the benefits and wisdom of offshore development?
I can answer first. Obviously, the first impact would be where the development takes place and what Shell has done, and I think they were right to do it, was to really be on the ground and get involved with the communities, and just by doing that, they could learn from maybe not science, but traditional knowledge about you can't put a road there, you'll sink. You can't go that way or that way. Maybe they learned from that. At least they went to the communities and took the time to learn that. And obviously, all communities in Alaska would hope that where there is development, and if it does happen, the companies will perform local native hire. That's the best outcome for especially economic development, especially in much of Village Alaska, which can only rely on industry to have a job. Otherwise, there's literally a lack of jobs. So that's obviously a benefit of development around communities. The benefits to other communities, while oil and gas might not be developed in that region, there's revenue sharing. So it depends on who's involved in the development, and it is shared throughout the regions, throughout all of Alaska. So that's a benefit that will extend to all communities.
Jim, did you want to add anything to that?
No.
Okay. Mead, go ahead.
If I could say just one thing about revenue sharing, this issue, the Outer Continental Shelf development in Alaska does not have the same revenue sharing with the states as the Gulf states get. And when I say that we'd like to see it, it's not because we're trying to fill our coffers or be more, the blue-eyed Arabs of the North, as sometimes Alaskans have been described, but it's basically because 90% of our state budget, which is to serve rural communities and is to serve all our communities, comes from oil at this point. And we're going to a situation where the Alaska pipeline or shoreside facilities or connections to that pipeline may well be taxed only on a property tax basis rather than than the royalty sharing that we've, that the Gulf states have. And yet what that money goes for is, we're improving schools in 200 different communities right now. We just settled in one more lawsuit to upgrade education. We help balance the cost of energy in rural Alaska. We have lots and lots of airports where there aren't roads, 200 communities without roads. And to the extent that welfare of all of us is based on infrastructure, the state of Alaska has been a major contributor in infrastructure for many years from the oil industry money that we've gotten before. So I think that's very important for the quality of life that we have that. And I was in a meeting last year with leaders of communities throughout the North Slope Borough. And at that point, we realized that the value of the assets on the North Slope are about $16 billion in a depreciated value. And then you go take a look at what we're trying to get to. We're trying to see heavy oil developed at the existing fields at Prudhoe Bay. That's a $20 billion project. When I talk about natural gas and how we're now moving toward alignment on how we would go for an LNG project, that's a $30 billion project if it's a dime. We've got what Shell has spent already, which is about $4 billion, but if you get success in anything toward that 27 billion barrels or the 700,000 or 800,000 barrels a day, you're talking about tens of billions of dollars. So we have to be prepared to attract investment, but just know that the benefits from that investment will be shared dramatically with communities in Alaska, as well as have a major payback for the federal treasury.
Jim?
No one that I know is a better evangelist for the benefits of the resources of Alaska than Lieutenant Governor Treadwell. He's knowledgeable. He's spent a good part of his life living and learning about it, and he does an excellent job. My view of this, the original question about the impacts of a spill, I was the executive director of the Exxon Valdez Restoration Plan and spent 4 years of life there. And then I was recently involved in this Deepwater Horizon. The reality is, and let's make it a little broader than just energy, there's transportation that Meade also does an excellent job of explaining far better than I can. We're talking about resource development in the Arctic and the incredible benefits that will accrue to all of us, Alaskans, but also the nation and the Arctic countries. But somehow we have not yet involved the people in a public participation. We don't go into the communities and sit down and talk with them about where are the important ecological areas and the subsistence areas. This is where we're going to drill. How can we do this safely and protect these areas? We don't say to people in the villages, here are the risks. We leave that to others. And then have a dialogue with elders about how do you feel we could do this. And then I got to tell you that the response means having trained personnel and equipment in the region on site capable of handling the worst case discharge. That's what it says in the National Contingency Plan. We need to talk to people in the communities and the nation about knowing that risk up front, along with those benefits, and assuring that we're doing everything possible. And that means investing and identifying those important ecological areas, bringing indigenous people together, and making sure that to identify subsistence areas, and having that information so that we can answer a question like yours with a monitoring, observation, and research program that says, here's the risk, here's who will be impacted, as well as here are the incredible benefits that you're going to get from this risk. Then we've got a dialogue, but we need a new paradigm. The outworn, antiquated approach, although we shuffled the cards a little bit and Interior, and this administration's done a great job of moving science into the forefront to drive decisions. Now we need to do a little better job of bringing people to the table to help in that decision to talk about benefits and risks.
I feel like I need to refute one of those comments. I think there was a lot of good points in there, but at least in terms of our community engagement, I mean, we have taken on those conversations. We might have been guilty of it in 2006, 2007, having a bit of the Gulf of Mexico-centric mindset that, we'll just roll in and do this. But ever since then, I would push back and say that in these 500 community engagements, that we have respected traditional knowledge and actually looked for food security, subsistence, respect. So I just push back on that a little bit.
And you should be commended for that. Yeah.
The public domain quite as much as it should.
Sure. I'll just say one thing and just to respond to that, and it'll be very simple. If in fact, I'm talking about an investment that would say to people, you wouldn't have to quarrel with me any longer. We wouldn't have this business of you suing the environmental community or the environmental community suing you. You would be able to turn right now to a map and you would say, let me show you what the elders taught us about the important ecological areas, and let me show you how they are protected. And let's now work with the administration. Here are the deferrals, and here are the designations of those marine protected areas that will not be damaged or harmed. And we're not going to drill there because we can do directional drilling, and we're going to invest X amount of dollars. You wouldn't have to have this debate. You would be able to do that, and it will come. That's the Arctic paradigm I'm talking about. We're capable of doing that. And under the U.S., and you are a corporate citizen. You are now under America's laws. You're a good citizen. And we are now in this together. It's not like the old days. And in the Arctic, we're going to be in that together. And that's what I'm talking about. So I think you've done a great job talking to the communities. There's just one more step, and that's where you could just turn around and say, let me show you what the elders taught us.
If you could convince me it was only one step, I'd be happy. I think it might be quite a lot.
Me, you wanted to
the oil won't go anywhere.
True. Jim Ayers and I have been friends for a long time, and Jim, I worked with you on the Exxon Valdez and so forth. But let me talk about this paradigm just in a second. I got an email this morning that today we lost Elinor Ostrom, the Nobel laureate, who had actually was a political scientist, but who won the Nobel for economics for working on the commons problem, and that was the problem that Garrett Hardin in 1968 had, in his famous essay, talked about the tragedy of the commons. And Hardin basically, if I take the academics, had said, because of the tragedy of the commons, you often need a government leviathan to sort out who gets what. And Ostrom came along and said, that's not what you need. What you need is lots of communication and cooperation. And she's special to us in Alaska. Her husband, Vincent, who she was a student of, this was a professor who married a student, was hired to help draft the Natural Resources Clause of the Alaska Constitution. And the Alaska Constitution makes it very, very clear it's important for us to develop our resources for the benefit of the people. And we push, we live by that Constitution. We try very hard. But Elinor Ostrom's concept that you need communication, that you need cooperation, that you need science, I think is one that I don't see anybody on this panel has not bought off on that concept. And one of the things we learned during Exxon Valdez is that when somebody who spills oil doesn't even know the fishermen are there to help them clean it up, we got a problem. We had the 8 Arctic nations meeting in Anchorage this spring, and we worked very hard to bring them to the United States to say, listen, we want you to know the people here in case there's a problem, because we're all going to have to address this together. And, Jim, I'll join the refutation in one respect. We've done lots, and a lot of it was to your work in getting community science centers up and down the coast of Alaska. The fishing groups have added to that. Now, Shell has been supportive, and we're trying to get more oil spill research directly in Barrow so that people can see where we're moving the cutting edge and learn from traditional knowledge. We just passed a rule to try to save languages in Alaska, because when you lose a language, you lose history. You lose, we've reconstructed the science of the caribou herd, the Central Arctic caribou herd, based on language and place names because we didn't have written record. Right. So I think we're all on the same page, and ultimately the biggest challenge I think some of these new ocean policy initiatives have had in the Arctic is building a level of trust that it's going to change the permitting for the better rather than stop everything to go get something new done. Right. And that's the fear that most Alaskans I talk to have, and that's why it's been a little slower than maybe you would have liked.
I understand.
Amy, let me throw that same question to you. How do you feel the oil industry has done in terms of interacting with and soliciting the views of Native groups?
I think Alaska is unique in that today, if there is going to be development, it's just going to be so obviously stark that there would be development in a rural, isolated village that it is absolutely important for a company to get involved with the community. There has to be trust and exchange and transparency and rather than have people have a perception that natives would be diametrically opposed to development, Alaska Natives are very adaptable. They have to be. That's how they survived over 10,000 years in that harsh environment. You also have to be pragmatic. There is going to be development, and the best you can hope for is economic development for your people, for your region. So the best thing to do, like Shell did, and we can point to that, is community engagement, and to show really the scope of what you plan to do, what you want to do, and ask the community for their thoughts and for their traditional knowledge and suggestions, and maybe make a community plan and just be involved.
One final question for the panel, and then we'll go to the floor. We've heard about projections if we look 10, 15 years out, and of course if large-scale oil were found, it would maybe become even a faster program. And this is ship congestion in the Bering Sea and the Bering Strait. With the unresolved border issue with Russia, I'd be interested to know, do you as an industry or do you as a public official, do you have much interaction with your kind of counterparts directly across in Russia about what you would do jointly in the event of a major oil spill or a maritime accident, ships colliding, or is there pretty much no immediate cooperation or even discussions with your neighbors?
Maybe I'll answer from our recent experience. So I think the blunt answer is no. I mean, everything is basically in U.S. federal waters and territories. Most of our evacuation, of course, through the Chukchi Sea or Bering Sea is icebound for 5 or 6 months of the year. So if the idea or mental model people have is that more tankers exporting the oil, whether it's to West Coast U.S., which is probably where the refining would get done, that's not the development model we have. I mean, we're trying to support the TAPS infrastructure and keep it alive for another 40 or 50 years.
But as we heard about more and more ships of all kinds potentially coming along the Northern Sea route and down to Asia through that passage, do you think this is an issue that more needs to be done between Alaska and local officials in Russia?
Yeah. Charlie, I can tell you, I'm one Alaskan who I can't see Russia from my house, but I have seen Alaska from Russia many times. The fact that Julie Gorley's here was on the last panel. Julie, you and some folks from the Coast Guard recently returned from Moscow, where you had a meeting with the Russians on the port access routing study. And one of the reasons why I believe it's very important that we hitch up with the Russians sooner rather than later, even before there's a lot of traffic, is because this is going to be such a vital waterway for energy from probably 6 nations of the world, going to many more than 6 nations. Even when the Renda, the Russian vessel, came, helped bail out the people of Nome, we had certain things that we wanted to make sure that they were aware of, that there were nesting zones, that there were subsistence zones. We've moved the track of the Coast Guard vessel Healy to the west to avoid whales when it was going there. And if the more coordination we have in this tight spot from the very beginning, the safer shipping is going to be, and the more we can affect and preserve food security. So it's very important that we get to that joint agreement with the Russians, in my mind, soon enough so we can take it to the International Maritime Organization. We've urged, the state of Alaska has said again and again, that there's a great inequity between what we ask of Shell on ship safety in the Arctic region and what we ask of the rest of the world. The ships passing through don't have to tell us they're coming. They don't have to tell us what they're carrying. They don't have to tell us what their contingency plan is. They don't have to meet the locals who might be helping them clean it up. They don't have to listen to us if we say, please move away from here because they've got whaling here. And we've already seen the problem with that. We have 5,000 ships a year go through the Aleutians, and we have occasional wrecks like the Selindang Ayu that show us there are those risks. So we're trying to address those risks early, and I've got to compliment the Coast Guard for taking that on, and compliment the fact that we do have regular bilaterals with the Russian Coast Guard. Very good lines of communication. We have joint enforcement of fisheries in that area. It's a multi-billion-dollar year fishery, so we police those lines fairly well together. I took it was tough for me. The last flight I made with the Coast Guard and the Russian Coast Guard through the Bering Strait, the Russian admiral brought out a bottle of vodka, and I was the designated person to do the toast because the admiral wasn't going to drink on his own airplane. But I will tell you, I will tell you this: the communication is strong. We're just coming up to the 25th anniversary of opening the border between Alaska and Russia. It'll be June of next year, and that happened under Governor Cooper. And there's lots that we had hoped for with that open border. There's lots of good things that have happened. I can show you many children on both sides of the border who are products of the fact that we have an open border, but there's much, much more cooperation we have to do.
Let's go to the floor, and please, again, identify yourself when you ask a question. Let's go back on this lady over here. Lady on the aisle over here, about halfway down.
Kasia Klimaszyńska from Bloomberg News. I keep hearing that there is very little infrastructure on the north coast of Alaska. So I have a question for Steve. How much Shell has already done in terms of adding, I don't know, hotels, roads, and how much more development will we see if indeed the company gets the permits this year?
Are we taking them directly, or?
Why don't we take a couple, then we'll... Yes. Mike's coming over to you.
Rob Warren, I have a two-part question. Charlie, you raised in the last panel the issue with the price of natural gas falling in the United States. Is it feasible to develop natural gas in the Arctic? Would you like to respond to that yourself? And Governor, is the Coast Guard sufficiently stocked with vessels and capability that you need in the Arctic?
All right, we'll take one there.
Yeah, Bill Jones, EIR. Governor, I'd like to ask you, with regard to the relations with the Russians, in the Russian press there's often comments about building a Bering Strait tunnel, and they're actually building their railroad up to that point where the tunnel can be built. I was wondering, has that come on your table at all? Have you seen the proposal? Has any initiatives been taken? And what do you think of it?
Why don't we take those three?
So on the question of the infrastructure, we're dominantly offshore, so we obviously have to put a huge, dominantly floating fleet in place, both to support deployment of the rigs, ice management vessels, oil spill response fleet, resupply, etc. Whilst a lot of that obviously has to sail up, essentially through Unalaska and Dutch Harbor from the west coast of America, there is also what we'd call supply chain of logistics, that getting the people and the materials and crew changes done through both Barrow and Wainwright have allowed some provision of infrastructure investment. So the one that would spring to mind would be around airfields, hangars to support search and rescue helicopters, for example. It's a means to an end in that respect. I mean, we've got to get our program properly supported, because as we talked about this morning in the closed session, we recognize it's remote. We recognize it's hostile. If it needs to be there, we have to bring it. We do get a lot of support from agencies like the Coast Guard, a lot of the regulatory inspections that are going on as we speak now of all of our kit. I mean, they all form a fundamental part to make sure that our logistics and supply chain are really ready to go.
You want to do the tunnel?
Do you want to do, let's save the tunnel for the end. Let's talk about gas for a second.
Well, Brookings did a study that came out about in early May where we looked at the feasibility of LNG exports, but from the lower 48 states. And this was because, of course, some of the people who were planning to import LNG, now that we've found so much shale gas, see no market and are applying to the federal government for permission to convert those facilities to export facilities. But you have a lot of very powerful interests, such as the petrochemical industry and chemical industry and others, who believe that shale gas offers incredibly cheap feedstock for their industries. They're talking about bringing those industries back from overseas, producing good American manufacturing jobs. And so they're worried that exports might send prices back up. In our study, we concluded that there was plenty of gas to meet the needs of the manufacturing sector to back out 45 or 50,000 megawatts of old coal-fired plants and still have gas be available for export without a significant impact on the American consumer, either for gas prices or for electric prices. But in that same study, what we showed was that between now and 2020, there will be a shortage of LNG in the world, in the Pacific market particularly. And that the people like Cheniere, who have gotten in early, when their project comes to full fruition about 2017, they'll do very well. They should do very well because of the arbitrage play between the low price at the Henry Hub in Oklahoma and the world price in the Asian and to a lesser extent European markets. I mean, right now you've got gas selling for $16 to $18 in Japan, and if we could export gas right now, we could probably get it delivered, regasified for $10, plus or minus. So there's a huge arbitrage play right now. But after 2020, the market tightens considerably because you have huge projects coming on in Australia. You've got the possibility of the large gas finds that have been discovered along East Africa beginning to come into the market there. You've got coal, barring a global price in carbon, remaining very competitive in the Asia-Pacific market for electric power. But they're wild cards. You know, is China's shale gas going to prove to be economic or not? You know, it's in areas that are water constrained. But if China can all of a sudden produce a lot of shale gas, needs less LNG, that's a big factor. Is Japan going to continue to keep their nuclear power plants closed? You know, big surge in LNG demand has occurred since Fukushima because of Japan shutting down all its nuclear reactors. So when you start looking at an LNG project from the North Slope, say, it's going to be very dicey in that time frame of probably 2020 to 2030. That's not to say there may not be a market. There's so many things that could happen, but I don't see any market for that gas in the lower 48 in any feasible time frame, probably out to 2035, 2040. But in the world market, it may be a demand.
Let me tell you what we're doing, because I think the view that Charlie put out is pretty similar to the view that we see and the view that the three major producers own the gas. First off, there are people in this room who have dedicated a large portion of their lives, I'm looking at Senator Pierce over here, in trying to bring natural gas to North America. And we have a project that we licensed under Governor Palin with TransCanada that has done substantial engineering, substantial cost estimating, substantial permitting, and those permits remain in place. If something dramatic happens in the North America market, in my 30-year career, I've seen it now happen twice, we would be ready to ship to that market. At the same time, we have brought the three North Slope producers together in January, and then they sent us a letter in March that said that they hope to find alignment by the third quarter of this year on how they would pursue an LNG project in Asia. And whether that's a 2 billion cubic foot a day project, 14 to 18 million tons a year, whether it's one that would aim for markets in the 2018 time frame or really not get there until 2022, 24, those are some of the questions that we're looking to answer right now. But I can tell you that we've heard from Japanese buyers, we've heard from new independent power producers in Asia who see an opportunity. I was in China where this was something the Premier brought up in a meeting with us last fall. So there's definitely interest in our gas. And I'll just leave you with this on that subject. In the last 24 hours, we took 8 billion cubic feet of gas out of the ground, and we stuffed it back in the ground. Okay? We did it to keep up pressure on the oil to come through. And yeah, you do need pressure in that reservoir for the oil to come through. But at the same time, there are a lot of other oil wells back there that we choked back to virtually nothing because they were producing too much gas with their oil. And until we get gas infrastructure off the, figure this, if we got 35 trillion cubic feet of gas that we know of on the North Slope, it was all found by accident. It was found by people like this guy who were looking for oil, not gas. Okay? And until we get and until we find a way to get the infrastructure off the slope, we've got a problem. And the whole potential that you've been listening to today about the Arctic has got a problem. So it's very important that we solve this mystery one way or the other, and we're working very hard on it.
Did you want to do the tunnel?
I'm going to do icebreakers in the tunnel. The state of Alaska supports the construction of new Coast Guard icebreakers. I have to say our congressional delegation, Bob King is here from Senator Begich's office. We have a group of people from Senator Murkowski's office here. The Alaska delegation is all working together, and we're very glad that this president, and it's something that has been chewed on, the Arctic policy before it came out of the White House in 2009, one of the major food fights was law of the sea, and the other was icebreakers. And the question of do we as a nation recognize we need new icebreakers, I think we've come to that realization. The Alaska coastline is more than the rest of the coastline of the country put together. An admiral said to me the other day, I'm not sure we can afford icebreakers. Well, I said to Admiral, I'm not sure we can afford California or the Louisiana Purchase either, but this is America, and we have interests, and we do need to protect them. We also have ship traffic coming through that very honestly is not regulated, not regulatable, and needs to be policed. So we're pushing for it, and frankly, I think it'd be a shame if we dismantle the icebreakers we've got, or one of the icebreakers we've got, while we work to build the others. On the tunnel, thanks for the question. I made my first trip across Russia with former Governor Hickel in 1981 at the height of the Soviet Empire. And at that point, I remember we got a briefing on the tunnel then, and I've had many since. We said, this may not happen in our lifetimes, but let's keep talking about it. What's fun about it is this. One, if we don't recognize the geography, we lose a lot else in translation. Russia is a neighbor. You can laugh at, you can see Russia from my house. It was a good laugh line for Saturday Night Live, but the fact is that we do have proximity and we have lots of common opportunity. And the Russians have now extended the Trans-Siberian Railroad pretty much to the borders of Yakutsk. They sent a delegation to Alaska in the last year looking at a bridge or a tunnel into Yakutsk, and it's part of a plan moving toward the Bering Strait. The state of Alaska has done feasibility studies on how to hook up the Alaska Railroad to the North American system, because frankly, as we see the port of Prince Rupert moving north, there are other, the fact is West Coast ports are crowded, and we may well be one of the best ways to come in from the Pacific to North America. I don't know who's going to pay for that last 1,000 miles of rail or that tunnel, but I will say that in terms of the bigger schemes of things, we are seeing transportation advance. We do have roads to resources where we're looking at a road connection to Nome now, and it never hurts to be imaginative, even in a session like one at Brookings. So thank you.
Jim, did you want to?
I just want to. Well, first of all, I always want to commend my friend Meade. And of course, both of us at different times, and sometimes at the same time, we're under the wing and influence of good Governor Wally Hickel. And of course, when I was running the Marine Highway, he wanted to combine the railroad and the Marine Highway and wanted to know what it would take, because he wanted to get a ferry out to the Bering Straits until we could get the tunnel built. And so he had an idea there. Let me go back one moment, though, to the paradigm, because as you know, I won't leave it alone. We're in a new world. You were talking about shipping meat, and there was over 3,000 ships this past year, although Coast Guard has not released an actual number through the Great Circle trade route. You mentioned that Salang Dang IU, and the risk every day is of vessels going up through Unimak Pass, as you know, and across the Aleutian Islands there. There's another situation where under this new paradigm, it's in the interest of corporations who are paying their fair share and so forth to have some standards, Arctic standards that everybody has to live by. And under this, I'm going to mention, there's a new coalition forming in the Arctic paradigm. The United States military and the NGO community, certainly the Pew Environmental Group and Ocean Conservancy and others, have an interest in seeing corporations and the military and the state of Alaska all are interested in protecting that shipping byway through identifying those important ecological areas and finding a way where we could agree on how to protect them. And I'm not suggesting anything about an ocean policy or any of that stuff. I'm not going down that route. I'm talking about one thing, important ecological areas and working with communities. I don't have that other hidden agenda that you might think. I think the same is true of gas. There's a common interest in conservationists, the industry, the military, the state of Alaska in getting that gas to market one way or another. And I think there's a new coalition building for an Arctic paradigm that puts previously non-traditional allies together to promote things that have to do with sustainable development in the Arctic. And I just want to say, that's what I mean by an Arctic paradigm. And I think that we can get there, and I think we see paths differently. I don't think the old way will work. I think we have to have a new way. We've all said, I've heard, I can't tell you how many political speeches, including my own, about, we're going to have the first shovel of dirt on that new gas pipeline. And we've all lived through that. But we could do it together, I think. And that's what I'm proposing.
Some other questions from the floor, way in the back?
Question for Governor or Lieutenant Governor, I don't know what the right terminology is, and Mr. Phelps. First question, and I have a point. How much of this new oil and gas development is dependent on the existing level of sea ice retreat? And how much of future oil and gas development anticipates further sea ice retreats? You're very bullish about the future in the long term. So how much of that in your mind, or in reality, is dependent on the fact that the Arctic has warmed so substantially and the sea ice has already retreated significantly and is projected to do so? My point really is for the moderator. I think both panels have sort of missed critical element here, which is, and the common heritage is really related to the climate system. And it involves Greenland, which has enough ice, 6 meters worth of ice, if it all goes, will raise sea level 6 meters. If the sea ice goes, it changes the entire reflectivity of the planet, as well as the massive habitat loss. And will change, and is already changing mid-latitude weather. So I think maybe there's a real discussion about the global importance of the Arctic, not its importance so much to Arctic nations alone, but to the whole planet, because in fact, Miami is dependent on the fate of Greenland, so because of the sea ice problem. But I want to go back to my question is, how much of the oil and gas today do you feel is dependent on sea ice retreat, and how much in the future?
Thank you for an excellent question. Yes.
Hi, Michael Tubman with the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. Similarly, climate change, as was just mentioned, is offering us a huge opportunity in the Arctic for energy development. Climate change elsewhere in Alaska is causing some challenges, whether it's migrating fish stocks, changes in forestry patterns, coastal erosion. And there's clearly going to be a huge, tremendous amount of investment and resources and attention given to energy development in the Arctic. I just want to know how are Alaskan corporations, Alaska, the state government, and Alaskans themselves looking to make sure that some of those resources, investments, and attention also go towards mitigation and adaptation of climate change challenges in the state?
I think those two questions give fertile ground for some discussion before we come back to the audience.
So on the, are we banking on further sea ice retreat in terms of our plans for oil and gas development? No. I think we've seen that it can be a little bit misleading to say that, you know, we've had the sea ice retreat in total area or total volume. It also depends where it is in the Arctic. It's a big place. So there is almost a glorious irony that this year, of course, we have more multi-year ice in the Chukchi Sea and the Bering Sea than we have had for the last 10 or 12 years. So just the year we're trying to get there. What I've observed, and I'm a complete rookie, I'm an Australian with a desert background rather than a frozen North Arctic background. What I've observed in the 3 years I've been doing this, there is huge volatility. So prediction is actually incredibly difficult, even to within, you know, plus or minus 6 weeks. Sea ice thaw in any given area when the sea ice refreezes in the fall as well. So I would genuinely say, I mean, we're just not that clever, quite honestly. I think Shell, it has an ice and weather forecasting capability that it's developed now over 20 plus years since we actually drilled in the Chukchi Sea back in 1989. So was that 23 years ago? And we've kept statistics over that I would argue is probably, you know, as good, if not better, than what NOAA possessed for those high latitudes there. And there is just this huge volatility. So we don't see any patterns, and we're not banking on it.
From my own experience as chair of the Arctic Research Commission and listening to a lot of science, I think I'd say that what's happening with shipping, what's happening in oil and gas is not dependent on sea ice receding. It's you're seeing global demand, and you're also seeing improved technology, and you're seeing that in shipping as well as in the oil and gas side. When it comes to the services, you know, Rafe, I don't know if we've met, but I've read your stuff for years, and I think it's very important that we understand the very valuable services the Arctic provides to the world with albedo and ice reflectivity, with biodiversity, with two of the richest fisheries in the world, and the concerns that we have about ocean acidification with climate change, the concerns that we have about erosion. All have led us to kind of a policy of supporting research and supporting adaptation. There's some of these things that you know, if the scenarios play out, they're going to be very, very hard to adapt to. But at the same time, you know, the world is using oil and gas today, and we believe this is an appropriate, efficient place to get it. So I would just leave it at that, and I hope I'm answering your question too, Michael. We've spent a lot of time. There was a sub-cabinet created now about 6 or 7 years ago, which has developed an adaptation agenda for the state. We're working to move, working in consortium with villages. I'll tell you that oil spill that happened this week was an Army Reserve ship on its way to help a village move there. So there's you know, lots of activity going on in response to changing climate, and lots more monitoring and research that we need to invest in. And whether or not we can change it, I think the Arctic Council countries, back from the time of the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, looked to say, is there something the Arctic could do alone to reverse this trend? And I don't think we saw it. We focused a little bit on black carbon, and that's something which is pretty important because it may help explain some of the rapid changes that we're seeing in the Arctic today. And we want to see cleaner vessels. We want to pay attention to that, and I think that's an important project of the Council. But in the meantime, I think you will hear from most Arctic jurisdictions that we're working hard to adapt.
Jim?
Yeah, I think the albedo effect, other things that me just mentioned, you know, as goes the Arctic, so goes the planet right now. And I think we're now all beginning to realize how true that's going to be in lots of different ways. As goes the Arctic, so goes the planet with regard to this issue of climate change. It's been the ice box that's cooled the planet, et cetera. But it also means that as goes the Arctic, so goes the planet, and how we as a people are going to deal with the question of the extraction or providing of energy for 7 billion people going to 10 billion people. And that's a hell of a challenge that we all have. But it's going to be as goes the Arctic, so goes the planet.
I'll make a comment too, Charles. In terms of climate change, there's elders and people of of the next generation, or next 2 generations, my age, that have seen it happen in our own lifetimes, and it's astounding, actually. The Army Corps of Engineers ship that was shipping equipment to help Nukhtak. Nukhtak is just about on the Bering Sea. They're sinking, and they're being eaten away by their river, and they have to move, and they're actually in the process of moving. So it was actually core equipment that was on its way that got stuck, and that was kind of a timely article, I guess, because it highlights what villagers and natives hope corporations, companies like Shell and the Corps of Engineers would be prepared for, is if you run aground or have a spill, are you going to be ready for it? And I know, is it right to thank God that they hit a rock in Kodiak, right where there is a Coast Guard station? But it just goes to show it happened there in Kodiak. Thank goodness. Villagers need to be assured that there's going to be quick response elsewhere, all the way up the coast, because having as much coastline as we do, it's odd to think that we don't have a lot of deep water ports. Try and imagine the coast of the continental U.S. with maybe just a handful of ports. So that's what a lot of villagers are also hoping and looking for, is the ability to be just at the same standard of operation as other countries.
All the way in the back, 2 all the way in the back. We'll take one and then the other one.
Thanks, Charlie. Kevin Massey with the Energy Program here at Brookings. I've got 2 questions. One is a broad question, another is a specific one. We've heard a lot about cooperation through the Arctic Council, but as we saw in the Gulf of Mexico, Macondo blowout, often it's industry that has the technical ability and the knowledge to respond most effectively to oil spills. Earlier this year, there was a response technology joint industry program that was set up with several major international oil companies. I'd like to hear the views of the panel on organizations like that as taking forward and being the most effective means of responding to spills, and how lessons learned in Arctic US, i.e. Alaska, can serve as models for drilling and energy development elsewhere in the Arctic. The second question is more specific, and it relates to, it's probably one for Steve more than anybody else, but presumably if oil is found in large quantities this summer, that will lead to greater exploration, which will, and combined with sea ice retreat, presumably more seismic activity, mapping of the region using seismic arrays will take place. Can you talk about the effects of that seismic activity on sea life, bow whales, and so on? I understand that there is the potential for seismic to really disrupt the activities of key sea life in the region. Thank you.
Can we get the one back in this corner? We had a hand up.
Yes. Hi, Mark Chandler. I'm new to Vegas. I'm also a desert rat from Las Vegas, Nevada. Listening to your discussion about oil and gas, what opportunities do you see for renewable energy development so that you can, have other sources of energy?
Great. Who wants to start on those?
I think there was a couple in there that you asked in particular, Kevin, as well as the gentleman here. So I think the capability we've built in oil spill response, which is very much in the public domain at the moment, does tend to neglect the amount of work that we actually do in prevention in the first place. The best thing to do if you don't want to clean up an oil spill is prevent it happening. So in terms of calibration, in terms of planning, in terms of monitoring, in terms of multiple barriers to ever prevent oil getting out of the subsurface, God forbid, into the ocean and the nice conditions. And this isn't just Shell. I think the whole of industry is undertaking a huge amount, stimulated post-Macondo, a huge amount of technology advances and research. I would say from our perspective that we've probably gone what I would say above and beyond the regulations demand. So there was a new wave of NTLs that came out that we had to meet that described worst case discharge, and it really was the worst of the worst of the worst. Very difficult to actually see it, envisage it actually happening. And yet, to be honest, we've also volunteered a capping stack, a containment system at 100% Shell cost at the moment as well. So the prevention side is very important. The answer to your question, I think the sort of joint industry projects that are trying to further the science of oil spill response, not so much in open water, but in those sort of shoulder seasons where we could be drilling in this very unlikely event of an oil spill when you've got slushy ice forming. That's where these JIPs are sort of testing technology. They're looking at modeling trajectories in various parts of the world, not just Alaska. They're looking at the various effectiveness of responses in ice conditions. We have a gentleman called Peter Velez, who some of you may know is probably one of the world experts on essentially oil spill response, not just in Arctic and ice conditions, but around the world. He's the chair of this 9-company joint industry project. It's multi-year. It will include field trials. I think that's one of the most important things is we can all do a lot of mathematical modeling and spreadsheet work, but you actually need somewhere where you can demonstrate the effectiveness of these techniques on a sort of a pilot controlled basis. So completely wedded to those. Can I just answer his second question while I'm in sort of full flow? You sort of mentioned extra exploration if we're successful. So we do have quite a portfolio, if you like, particularly in the Chukchi Sea, but also in the Beaufort Sea. We didn't bid our $2.1 billion on leases because we were being generous. We wanted to be competitive. We wanted to win, but we saw significant potential, and that does go way beyond the 6 wells that we've been trying to drill for the last few years and that we currently have permitted for this year and next year. I actually think there will be quite an internal debate within Shell and the industry and the local communities in the state of Alaska that if we had a very big success, justifying going looking for more big success when we really should be focusing on bringing that to the benefit of Alaska to create local jobs. I think that would be a much more demanding situation than perhaps drilling more exploration wells. So the jury is a little bit out on that, I think, about how we balance what we'd call appraisal versus future exploration. On the seismic activities, we're very cognizant of, let's say, cumulative impact. So we are, if you like, not setting a benchmark, but I think the perception is that if Shell is drilling with 2 rigs in the Chukchi Sea, or 1 in the Chukchi, 1 in the Beaufort, that's setting a bit of a sort of a mental threshold that people think that's what should only be allowed. Probably not fair to people who've spent $2.1 billion to think that we probably need a little bit more parallel activity. I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that we could prosecute the whole of that portfolio. But again, to be seen. Someone wished me success with the wells this year, and we're certainly hopeful.
Success. Anybody else wanted to comment on any of that?
Just on the response question that Kevin raised originally, for 6 months I was in the Gulf of Mexico, part of the panel reviewing the preparedness and response capability. And I think you'd agree with this, Steve. We weren't really prepared. All the talk of the Exxon Valdez, it was very difficult emotionally to be a part of that. We know that as long as there's been oil wells drilled or there's been ships, there have been accidents. And I think that's something that we have to be concerned with. We also know that we can't clean it up very well. I mean, I don't know. I don't mean that in an argumentative sense. We know that less than 25% was cleaned up in the Gulf of Mexico. We know that we've got to do better, and I'll go back to standards and one other thing in terms of the new paradigm. And Meade talked about this earlier. We need to do more research. We need to fund some science and research. And I'm not talking about stopping drilling while you're doing that. I'm talking about investing in monitoring, observation, and research. OSROs, oil spill response organizations responsible for responding, there ought to be Arctic standards. You have them for the Great Lakes. We now are developing for the Gulf of Mexico. And I just recently was asking somebody from the Coast Guard, we don't yet have that, and I'd love to work with you on that, Meade. We ought to have Arctic standards for response, and we don't have that yet. There's some things that we could do a better job of because we know the risk is high, or the probability is high.
Do you want to add anything?
Well, on that issue and the renewables question, on this issue, in the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 that you passed, Senator Warner, after the Exxon Valdez, we committed ourselves as a nation to a research program that included a regional research program. The Coast Guard that was put in charge of it had two guys in Groton who, after a couple of years, had virtually no money to grant whatsoever. It was only about 2 years ago, in fact, it was just before the Macondo incident, that the interagency group, ICOPAR, actually started meeting again. We now collect 8 cents a barrel for every barrel of oil used in this country, and some of that money every year ought to be used to help push the envelope on oil spill response. And what Jim talked about, Arctic standards, we have a group meeting in the Arctic Council right now on coming together with better standards on prevention and response. It's meeting this month, actually, in Iceland. So there is a forum there to try to make that happen. Julie, if I'm missing anything, let me know there. On the renewables, a question asked from a fellow from Las Vegas. I've forgotten your name, but I apologize. Mark. We have a goal in the state of Alaska to get to 50% renewable electric power by 2025. And our portfolio to get there includes hydro, new hydro, wind, geothermal, tidal, and probably some other things I haven't mentioned there. Just looking around the Arctic and the benefit of the Arctic neighborhood is very interesting. Watching Norway, which has a policy of produce hydrocarbons for sale and try to use as much renewable as you can domestically, now looking at export of renewables through DC cable to Holland. Greenland and Iceland are looking at the potential of DC cables to export power. There's a project in southeast Alaska that's looking at trying to export power to the North American power grid. I was with a group of lieutenant governors meeting with the Secretary of Energy by telephone the other day where we were talking about stranded renewables, especially a large number in Alaska. Some of our best geothermal potential projects are in places where there's not a whole lot of demand for the fuel. So finding ways to move that fuel around, whether it's hydrogen or ammonia or bringing facilities there, are questions. But I'm very enthusiastic about our renewable energy potential. There was a meeting that David Hayes, Deputy Secretary of Interior, had last week with a group of Alaskans on this. And I can tell you that this is what's pushing us here is we are one of the most expensive places in the world for energy outside the rail belt grid between Anchorage and Fairbanks. And even Fairbanks is hurting very bad. And as a result, we're one of the best proving grounds for renewable energy in the country. And that's why you've seen adoption of wind diesel, for example, in Alaska higher than all of Canada, and we're leading the world. And we are going to continue to push to lead the world with significant investment. And last but not least, there have been years where our budget for retrofitting buildings and using conservation has been higher than the entire U.S. budget. So we're interested in that as well.
I'll speak to renewables also. I worked with the Alaska Village Electric Cooperative, and they handle 56 53 villages throughout Alaska, mostly along the Bering Sea coast. The first success story of displacing standalone diesel-burning power sites was Gasigluk, and that's inland. It's not on a river. So, so their best renewable resource would be wind, so they integrated turbines with the diesel-burning site, and they were able to integrate power into there and make tie-ins to Nunalpachuk and another village. And the board of AVEC is made up of villagers from their villages, and their goal, about the same time as Alaska's goal, was to reduce diesel generating power through diesel burning generating sites by 50%. And right now, the most powerful resource for that renewable resource is wind. And Gasigluk, about 5 years ago, was able to reduce burning about 65,000 gallons of diesel, and that's a huge success, considering that most of these villages rely solely on burning diesel to generate power.
I want to thank our panel. I think I know the governor has I think you have a plane to catch not too distant future. Want to thank all our panelists for an outstanding session. And before closing, I'd like to also thank a number of you, without naming you individually, who were extremely helpful in identifying critical people that we should have at our session today. Thank you very much. As I mentioned, this is the first in what we envisage as a number of panels and symposia dealing with various Arctic issues. This was kind of a big macro view, and we'll get down to more select issues in the future. But thank you all very much, and I particularly want to thank members of my own staff, Kevin Massey and Govinda Vasarala, for the hard work they put in making this a bang-up forum. Thank you.
Thank you.